The carriage door swung open before the wheels had even stopped rolling, and Alara Whitmore's heart slammed against her ribs. She gripped the edge of the seat with both hands, her knuckles turning pale because she knew what was coming. She had heard her father's voice through the study wall only 2 days ago, cold and flat, saying words that still echoed in her mind like a struck bell. He had called her a burden. He had called her a debt that needed to be paid. And now here she was, being delivered to a stranger's estate like a parcel wrapped in silk and shame. She could not walk. She had not been able to walk since she was 11 years old, when a fall from the east stairwell of her family's crumbling manor had crushed something deep in her spine that no physician, however skilled or however expensive, had ever been able to mend. For 6 years she had lived in a world that moved around her while she stayed still, carried from room to room by servants who sighed when they thought she could not hear them, propped up at dinner tables where her father barely looked at her, and whispered about by relatives who called her poor Alara, in tones that made the word poor sound like an insult rather than sympathy. Her father, Baron Edmund Whitmore, had never forgiven her for the accident, though it had not been her fault. He had never forgiven her for the doctor's bills, for the specialists brought from 3 counties away, for the wheeled chair built at great expense that now sat folded beside her in the carriage like a mute witness to her helplessness. And when the family's fortune had finally crumbled under years of poor decisions and worse luck, he had found, in his own daughter, the one asset he had left to sell. The Duke of Ashcombe had sent a letter. It had arrived on a gray morning, sealed with dark wax, and her father had read it twice before calling for his steward. Alara had not been permitted to see its contents until the arrangement was already settled. A marriage, a contract, a debt erased in exchange for a bride who could not stand at her own wedding. She had wept for one night only, because she had promised herself long ago that she would not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her broken more than once. Now the carriage rocked to a final stop, and through the small window she saw gray stone walls rising taller than anything she had seen before, framed by neat gardens and a sky heavy with the promise of rain. The estate of Ashcombe looked like something out of an old story, but Alara felt no wonder, only dread. She imagined how it would happen. A footman would open the door and stare at her, unsure how to proceed. Perhaps 2 servants would be summoned to lift her out, awkward and unpracticed, dropping her dignity somewhere on the gravel path along with her body. She had endured this scene before, in front of relatives, in front of doctors, in front of curious strangers at market squares. She braced herself for it now, jaw tight, eyes fixed on her folded hands. But the door did not stay empty for long. A tall figure stepped forward before any footman could reach the carriage. He wore a dark gray coat, unadorned by the excessive gold trim she expected from a duke, and his boots were slightly mudded, as though he had been walking the grounds rather than waiting idly inside for his bride to arrive. His hair was dark, touched faintly with early silver at the temples, and his face held an expression Alara could not immediately place. It was not pity. It was not curiosity dressed up as concern. It was something quieter, something that looked almost like respect. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice low and even, "I am Alaric Ashcombe. Welcome to my home." Alara opened her mouth to respond, but before she could form a single word, he had already leaned into the carriage. She stiffened, expecting him to call for help, to summon the footmen who stood a respectful distance away, unsure of their role. Instead, he simply reached forward, slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. She froze. Every instinct in her body told her to protest, to insist that this was improper, that a duke did not carry his unwanted bride out of a carriage with his own 2 hands like she was something precious, rather than something traded away. But no words came. She only stared at him, searching his face for the flicker of disgust or discomfort she had seen so many times before on the faces of people forced to touch her. There was none. He carried her with the same unhurried calm he might have shown carrying a stack of books from one room to another, his steps steady on the gravel, his gaze fixed forward rather than lingering on her in a way that made her feel like an object on display. The gathered staff, lined up along the entrance in their neat uniforms, watched with expressions of quiet surprise, though none of them said a word. A young maid near the door pressed her lips together as though holding back a smile, but she quickly composed herself when the Duke's eyes passed over her. "You did not need to do that yourself," Alara finally managed to say, her voice smaller than she intended. "There are servants for such things." "There are," Alaric agreed, his tone unbothered. "But you are not a piece of luggage to be handed from one set of hands to another. You are a guest in my home, and soon my wife. I would not have it said that I let others do for you what I am capable of doing myself." Alara did not know how to respond to that. No one had ever spoken to her in such a manner, as though her comfort were a matter of principle rather than an inconvenience to be managed. She studied his face for any sign of performance, any hint that these were simply pleasant words meant for the ears of watching servants, but his expression remained plain and unguarded, as though he had said nothing remarkable at all. He carried her through wide doors into an entrance hall lined with tall windows, where soft afternoon light spilled across polished floors. She noticed, almost against her will, that there were no uneven steps at the threshold, no awkward little staircases of the kind that had trapped her in countless other homes. The floor was level and smooth, stretching into a corridor that appeared, from what little she could see, to be free of obstacles. "Your rooms are on the ground floor," Alaric said, as if reading the question forming in her mind. "I did not think it wise nor kind to place you somewhere that would require you to be carried up and down stairs each day like cargo." "You planned this," Alara said slowly, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "Before you had even seen me, before you knew what I looked like or whether I was disagreeable or plain or anything at all." "I knew you could not walk," he replied simply. "That was enough to plan for. The rest of you I intend to learn in time." He set her down gently in a wide, cushioned chair near a window overlooking the gardens, and only then did he step back, giving her the space to gather herself. Alara smoothed the fabric of her travel dress with trembling fingers, unsure whether her hands shook from the journey or from something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. "I imagine you have been told a great many things about this arrangement," Alaric said, standing a respectful distance away, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "About me, about what is expected of you." "My father told me very little," Alara admitted, and there was no hiding the bitterness that crept into her words. "Only that a debt would be settled, and that I would be sent here in exchange. He did not consider it necessary to explain much beyond that. I do not believe he saw the need to soften the matter for my benefit." Something shifted in Alaric's expression then, a tightening around his jaw that Alara could not fully interpret. "Your father and I have concluded our business arrangement," he said carefully. "But I want to be clear with you, Miss Whitmore, that whatever passed between him and myself does not define what will pass between you and myself. I did not send for a debt to be paid. I sent for a wife, and I intend to treat you as one, not as a transaction concluded and filed away." Alara wanted to believe him. Some small, stubborn part of her wanted desperately to believe that this stranger, this Duke with his quiet voice and steady hands, meant every word he said. But 6 years of being carried, discussed, and dismissed had taught her caution, and caution was not easily unlearned in the space of a single afternoon. "Forgive me if I find that difficult to accept so quickly," she said. "I have learned not to trust kindness that arrives without explanation." "That is fair," Alaric said, and to her surprise, he did not seem offended by her honesty. "I do not ask you to trust me today. I only ask that you allow yourself to observe over time whether my actions match my words. Trust built on evidence tends to last longer than trust given freely and cheaply." A young maid entered then, carrying a tray of tea and light refreshments, and set it carefully on a low table beside Alara's chair, positioned within easy reach of her hands. Alara noticed the small detail immediately, the way the tray had been placed not out of habit, but out of consideration for exactly where she was seated and what she could comfortably reach. It was such a small thing, and yet it struck her more deeply than any grand gesture might have. "Thank you," Alara said to the maid, whose name she did not yet know, and the young woman offered a shy smile before retreating from the room. "Her name is Lucy," Alaric offered. She has been asked to attend to you personally, should you wish it, though of course you are free to choose differently if you prefer another arrangement. You have thought of everything, Alara murmured half to herself. I have tried, he said. Though I imagine there will be things I have overlooked, things you will need to tell me because I could not have known to prepare for them. I would rather you correct me than suffer silently out of politeness. Alara studied him for a long moment, the afternoon light catching the edges of his dark hair, the calm set of his shoulders, the way he stood not as a man performing generosity for an audience, but as someone who simply expected himself to behave decently, without needing praise for it. It unsettled her more than cruelty would have. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty had a shape she could brace against. This quiet, steady consideration left her without any defenses prepared. May I ask you something, Your Grace? She said finally. Alaric will do if you are willing, he said, and yes, you may ask me anything. Why did you agree to this marriage? A duke of your standing could have chosen any bride in the country. Women with strong legs and stronger family names, women who could dance at your balls and stand beside you at court without drawing whispers. Why choose a woman your own household will need to carry? For the first time since she had arrived, something flickered across Alaric's face that looked almost like old pain, quickly masked but not quickly enough for Alara to miss it entirely. That is a longer story, he said quietly. One I will share with you in time when it feels right to tell it. For now, I will only say that I did not choose you out of pity, nor out of some strange desire to prove myself charitable to the world. I chose you because I believe a person's worth is not measured by the strength of their legs, and I have particular reasons for believing that so firmly. Alara did not press further, sensing that whatever lay behind his words was not meant to be pulled out carelessly on the very first afternoon of their acquaintance. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the window, watching the garden stretch out beneath a sky that had begun, at last, to clear. I did not expect kindness here, she admitted softly, more to the window than to him. I expected to be tolerated. I did not expect to be lifted from a carriage as though I mattered. You do matter, Alaric said, and there was no performance in his voice, only plain, quiet certainty. I intend to remind you of that as often as it takes for you to believe it yourself. Outside, the last of the gray clouds began to part, and thin streams of sunlight spilled across the garden paths below. Alara sat in the wide chair by the window, her hands finally still in her lap, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself the smallest, most cautious flicker of hope. She did not yet know what kind of man Alaric Ashcombe truly was beneath his calm words and steady hands. She did not know what secrets waited behind the pain she had glimpsed in his eyes. But she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever came next would not be the life of quiet dismissal her father had condemned her to. Something had shifted the moment those strong arms lifted her from the carriage, and Alara Whitmore, against every instinct built by 6 years of hurt, found herself curious to discover what that shift might mean. Morning arrived at Ashcombe with a softness Alara had not expected from a house so grand. Sunlight slid through tall curtains without the harshness she remembered from her father's estate, where the windows always seemed to let in either too much glare or too much cold. Lucy entered quietly, carrying warm water and a fresh dress, and helped Alara settle into her wheeled chair with a gentleness that felt practiced rather than reluctant. His Grace asked that you join him for breakfast in the small dining room if you feel rested enough, Lucy said, tucking a blanket over Alara's lap, though the morning was not particularly cold. But he was clear that you should rest instead if you prefer it. He said not to press you either way. I would like to see the house, Alara said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Curiosity had crept in overnight, quiet and persistent, refusing to be ignored. If that would not be an inconvenience. Nothing about you is an inconvenience here, miss, Lucy said, and though the words were simple, they settled somewhere deep in Alara's chest. A small stone dropped into still water. The wheeled chair moved smoothly across the polished floors, and Alara noticed again what she had noticed the day before. The complete absence of raised thresholds, the wide doorways, the corridors built without narrow turns that would have trapped her wheels. She wondered how long ago these changes had been made, and for whom, because surely a house was not built this way by accident, nor adjusted overnight simply to accommodate an unfamiliar bride. Alaric was already seated when she arrived at the small dining room, a modest space compared to what she imagined the grand hall must look like, with a single long window overlooking a hedge maze in the distance. He stood when she entered, which struck her as unnecessary given her chair could not carry her upright regardless of his manners, but she said nothing, recognizing that some habits ran deeper than practicality. "I hope you slept well," he said, gesturing for Lucy to wheel her to the place already prepared at the table, positioned without an awkward gap or mismatched height that would have made eating difficult. "Better than I expected," Alara admitted, "though I confess I am still trying to understand this house. Everything seems designed with a particular kind of person in mind, a person who cannot walk." Alaric's hand stilled briefly over his cup before he answered. "My younger sister, Margaret, suffered a fever as a child that left her legs weakened for many years," he said. "She recovered eventually, through long treatment and longer patience, but during those years I watched how little the world was built to accommodate her. I watched relatives speak over her head as though she could not hear them, watched servants hesitate to touch her out of some misplaced fear, watched my own father grow distant from her simply because she required more care than he wished to give." Alara sat very still, listening, understanding now the flicker of old pain she had glimpsed the day before. "When I inherited this estate, I made changes," Alaric continued. "Not because I expected to marry someone in a similar situation, but because I could not bear to build a home that excluded anyone the way my sister had once been excluded. It seemed only right." "Where is she now, your sister?" "Margaret lives 2 counties north, married to a kind man who never once made her feel like a burden," Alaric said, and something like quiet pride warmed his voice. "She writes to me often. I believe she will be very pleased to hear of you." Alara considered this new information carefully, turning it over the way she might examine an unfamiliar object, searching for hidden edges. It explained so much. The ramps, the wide doors, the low windows in her room positioned so she could see the gardens without needing to be lifted. It was not performance. It was memory shaped into architecture. "I am sorry," she said quietly, "for what your sister endured, and I confess I am somewhat relieved to understand why this house feels so different from every other house I have known." "You need not apologize for things you did not cause," Alaric said, "but I appreciate the sentiment." Breakfast continued in a comfortable rhythm, conversation drifting between lighter topics. The gardens, a family of foxes that had taken up residence near the old stone wall, a book Alaric had been reading about distant lands and stranger customs. Alara found herself laughing once, briefly, at a story about the estate's elderly gardener attempting to chase off a particularly bold goose, and the sound surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise Alaric, whose expression softened at the sound. After breakfast, he offered to show her the grounds himself, pushing her chair along smooth garden paths rather than summoning a servant to do so. Alara protested weakly, insisting it was beneath a duke to perform such tasks, but Alaric simply replied that dukes were permitted to do as they pleased, and it pleased him to show his new household to his new wife personally. The garden stretched wide and green, bordered by neat hedges and dotted with benches positioned at heights that would allow her chair to sit alongside them comfortably rather than apart. They passed a small pond where ducks paddled lazily near the shore, and Alaric paused there, allowing her time to simply watch the water without hurrying her along. "May I ask you something now?" Alaric said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Of course." "What happened? If you are willing to tell me. I do not ask out of idle curiosity, only because I would like to understand you better, and this is a part of your life that clearly shaped much of who you have become." Alara was quiet for a long moment, watching the ducks glide across the water's surface. She had told this story so few times, and always to people who either flinched at the details or grew uncomfortably sympathetic in a way that made her feel smaller rather than understood. "I fell," she said finally, "from the east stairwell of my family's home when I was 11 years old. I was running, which I was told never to do on those stairs because they were old and steep and poorly lit. I do not remember the fall itself, only waking afterward in a bed surrounded by physicians speaking in hushed voices, and my father standing near the door with an expression I did not understand at the time, but which I later recognized as something closer to disappointment than concern." "Disappointment," Alaric repeated, his voice carefully neutral, though Alara sensed the effort it took him to keep it so. "He never said so directly," Alara continued. "But over the years it became clear enough. I was his only child from his first marriage, and I believe he had once imagined I would marry well, secure useful connections for the family, perhaps produce an heir for whichever household I joined. After the accident, those plans became complicated, and complications, in my father's mind, were simply inconveniences to be managed or removed. And so he removed you," Alaric said quietly, "by sending you here." "Yes," Alara said, "though I do not believe he saw it as removal so much as resolution. A debt settled, a complication resolved, all in a single arrangement." Alaric knelt then, lowering himself so that his eyes met hers directly rather than looking down at her from above, a small gesture that Alara noticed immediately because so few people had ever bothered to do it. "I cannot undo what your father did, nor the years of feeling like a burden that he placed upon you," he said. "But I can promise you that within these walls, you will never again be treated as a complication to be resolved. You are not a debt paid, Alara. You are a person, with thoughts and preferences and a life that deserves to be lived fully, regardless of what your legs can or cannot do." Alara felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, and she blinked hard against the sensation, unwilling to weep in front of a man she had known for less than a day, however kind his words. "You speak as though you have already decided to care for me," she said, her voice unsteady. "We barely know one another." "That is true," Alaric admitted, rising back to his feet. "But I have decided to try, sincerely and patiently, and I believe that intention matters, even before it has been fully proven through time." They continued their walk through the gardens in comfortable silence, and Alara found herself studying the small details of the estate with new eyes. The low garden beds that would allow her to reach flowers without needing to be lifted, the wide gravel paths free of ruts and stones that might catch her wheels, the gentle slope of a small bridge crossing a narrow stream, built without steps of any kind. Later that afternoon, Alaric introduced her to members of the household staff individually, rather than simply presenting her to a lined-up assembly as though she were inspecting soldiers. He introduced Gareth, the estate steward, a broad-shouldered man with a kind face who bowed respectfully and promised to see to any needs she might have regarding the household's daily operations. He introduced Mrs. Fairweather, the housekeeper, whose sharp eyes softened considerably when she looked at Alara, and who insisted on knowing immediately whether the bed linens in her room were to her liking. He introduced the young stable boy, Peter, who blushed furiously when Alara thanked him for holding the garden gate open, and a dozen others besides, each greeted with the same patient care. By evening, exhaustion had settled deep into Alara's bones, not the exhaustion of physical exertion, since her chair carried the burden her legs could not, but the exhaustion of an entire day spent recalibrating everything she had believed about what her life would become. She had arrived expecting cold tolerance at best and open cruelty at worst, and instead had found a household built, quite literally, around the belief that she deserved comfort and respect. "You have been quiet since dinner," Alaric observed, as Lucy prepared to wheel Alara toward her rooms for the evening. "Is something troubling you?" "No," Alara said, and found to her surprise that it was the truth. "I am simply trying to understand how a single day could feel so different from 6 years of days that came before it." "Perhaps it is simply that today you were treated the way you always deserve to be treated," Alaric said. "And perhaps it will take time before that feels ordinary rather than remarkable." Perhaps, Ilara agreed softly. That night, alone in her room, Ilara lay awake longer than she intended, staring at the ceiling as moonlight traced pale patterns across the plaster. She thought of her father, of his cold calculations, and his easy willingness to trade her away as though she were nothing more than an unwanted piece of furniture. She thought of the years spent believing herself a burden, a complication, an inconvenience wrapped in silk dresses and hidden behind polite smiles at family gatherings. And she thought of Alaric kneeling beside her at the pond, speaking words that felt less like performance and more like promise. She did not yet know what the future held. She did not know what secrets remained unspoken behind Alaric's careful kindness, nor what challenges awaited them both as their unusual marriage unfolded before the watching eyes of society. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ilara Whitmore fell asleep not with dread coiled tight in her chest, but with something gentler, something that felt dangerously close to hope, settling quietly in its place. News of the wedding spread through the county faster than Ilara had anticipated, carried on the tongues of merchants and travelers who passed through Ashcombe's gates and left with stories to tell. Within a week, the estate began receiving letters of congratulation mixed with a thinner, sharper current of curiosity that Ilara recognized immediately, having lived beneath its weight for years. People wanted to know about the bride who could not walk. They wanted details, gossip, something to whisper about over afternoon tea in drawing rooms far from Ashcombe's gates. Alaric handled these inquiries with a calm that Ilara found herself admiring more each day. When a distant cousin wrote requesting an audience to see for herself what manner of woman the Duke had chosen, Alaric replied with a polite but firm letter declining the visit, stating simply that his wife was not an exhibit for curious relatives. When a local newspaper attempted to print a piece speculating on the circumstances of the marriage, painting Ilara as either a pitiable invalid or a fortune-seeking opportunist, depending on which rumor had reached the writer first, Alaric sent a brief, pointed correction that ended the matter before it could spread further. "You did not need to trouble yourself with that," Ilara said one afternoon, when he mentioned the newspaper incident almost as an afterthought over tea. "I have grown accustomed to being spoken about, as though I were not present to hear it." "That does not mean you should have to remain accustomed to it," Alaric replied. "I would rather spend my effort correcting falsehoods now than allow them to take root and grow into something harder to remove later." Despite his efforts, whispers persisted, as whispers always do, slipping through cracks no single letter could seal. Ilara heard fragments of them during a visit to the village market, carried by her chair along a smoothed path Alaric had specifically ordered built after learning she wished to see the shops herself rather than remain confined to the estate. Two women near a fruit stall lowered their voices when they noticed her approaching, but not quickly enough to hide their words entirely. "Can you imagine marrying a girl who cannot even stand at her own vows? Must be desperate for the money her father owed him. No other explanation makes sense for a man of his standing." Ilara kept her expression carefully neutral, refusing to let the words show on her face, though they settled uncomfortably in her chest all the same. She had spent years building walls against exactly this kind of cruelty, but hearing it now, in a place she had begun, cautiously, to think of as safe, stung more sharply than she expected. That evening she said nothing of the incident to Alaric, unwilling to burden him with something she felt she should be strong enough to endure alone. But Lucy, who had accompanied her to the market, mentioned it in passing to Mrs. Fairweather, who mentioned it to Gareth, and by the following morning Alaric knew. "You should have told me," he said gently, finding her in the small library where she often spent quiet mornings among the shelves he had arranged at heights she could reach without assistance. "It was nothing," Ilara said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Idle gossip from women with nothing better to occupy their minds." "I have heard worse." "That you have heard worse does not make it acceptable that you should hear it at all," Alaric said, settling into the chair across from her rather than looming over her, a habit she had noticed him maintain consistently since their first conversation by the pond. I will not pretend I can silence every unkind word spoken about you in every corner of this county. But I do not want you carrying these burdens alone, as though sharing them with me would somehow trouble me more than watching you suffer in silence. Alara set down the book she had been holding, considering his words carefully. I am not accustomed to sharing burdens, she admitted. For most of my life, doing so accomplished nothing except giving others another reason to see me as fragile. I do not see you as fragile, Alaric said. I see you as someone who has carried far too much alone for far too long, and who deserves the chance to set some of that weight down without fear of judgment. The wedding itself, held 3 weeks after her arrival, was a quieter affair than Alara had expected, attended by a modest gathering of close family and trusted friends, rather than the sprawling spectacle typically associated with a duke's marriage. Alaric had insisted on this arrangement specifically, explaining that he had no interest in turning their vows into a performance for society's amusement. The ceremony took place in the estate's private chapel, its floor level and unobstructed, allowing Alara's chair to sit beside Alaric at the altar rather than forcing some awkward accommodation that would draw every eye toward her limitations rather than the vows being spoken. Margaret, Alaric's sister, had traveled from 2 counties north to attend, and she greeted Alara with a warmth that felt immediate and genuine, embracing her carefully before the ceremony began. My brother wrote to me at length about you, Margaret confided quietly, settling into a seat near the front where she could speak with Alara before the service commenced. I confess I was curious to meet the woman who managed to make him smile so often in his letters. He has not smiled easily since our childhood, not truly, not until recently. He has been very kind to me, Alara said, feeling a flush of warmth rise in her cheeks. Kindness comes easily to him, Margaret agreed. But smiling, genuine smiling that has always been harder one, I am glad to see it returning. The ceremony proceeded simply, vows exchanged in clear, steady voices, and when the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, Alaric knelt beside Alara's chair rather than simply bending to kiss her, a gesture that drew a soft, surprised murmur from the small gathered crowd. It was a small thing, perhaps, in the grand scope of a wedding, but it told Alara everything she needed to know about the kind of marriage she was entering. Not one built on convenience or obligation performed for appearance's sake, but one built, deliberately and consistently, on genuine consideration. The small celebration that followed passed in a warm blur of quiet conversation and gentle laughter, far removed from the grand, exhausting spectacles Alara had witnessed at other noble weddings throughout her childhood. She found herself, for the first time in years, enjoying a social gathering rather than enduring it, buoyed by the knowledge that no one present intended to whisper about her the moment her back was turned, because Alaric had ensured that only those who genuinely wished her well had been invited at all. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the estate settled into quiet stillness, Alaric found Alara sitting near the library window, watching moonlight scatter silver across the garden below. Regrets, he asked lightly, though something more serious flickered beneath the teasing tone. None, Alara said, and meant it fully. Only gratitude and perhaps a small measure of disbelief that my life has changed so completely in so short a time. Change can be frightening, Alaric said, settling into the chair beside her. Even good change, perhaps especially good change when one has grown accustomed to expecting the opposite. I have spent 6 years believing myself unwanted, Alara admitted quietly. It will take longer than 3 weeks to fully unlearn that belief, I think, however much kindness surrounds me now. Then I will simply continue offering that kindness for as long as it takes, Alaric said simply. There is no deadline on patience, not in this house. Over the following weeks, life at Ashcombe settled into a gentle, comfortable rhythm. Alara learned the names of every servant on the estate, learned the layout of the gardens well enough to navigate them independently in her chair, and began, slowly, to feel less like a guest occupying borrowed space and more like a woman genuinely at home. She wrote letters to Margaret, who replied with warmth and humor that reminded Alara increasingly of Alaric's own quiet wit. She spent long afternoons in the library, reading books on subjects she had never before been permitted to explore, subjects her father had once declared unsuitable for a young woman regardless of her physical condition. She also began to notice, with growing curiosity, the quiet work Alaric conducted beyond the walls of the estate. Correspondence with tenant farmers regarding fair rents, careful management of accounts that seemed designed to benefit workers as much as the estate's own coffers, and occasional visits from local families who arrived not with complaints, but with simple gratitude for assistance quietly provided during difficult seasons. He never spoke of these efforts himself, and Alara learned of them mostly through overheard conversations among the staff, who clearly held their master in genuine, unforced respect rather than mere obligatory deference. One evening, as autumn began settling gently over the estate's gardens, painting the leaves in shades of amber and rust, Alara found herself studying Alaric across the dinner table with new eyes, seeing not simply the kind stranger who had lifted her from a carriage weeks earlier, but a man whose quiet generosity extended far beyond the walls of his own household, touching lives she had never even known to consider. "You are staring," Alaric observed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I am thinking," Alara corrected, "about how little I truly know of the man I have married and how much I find myself wanting to learn." "Then ask," Alaric said simply. "I have no secrets I intend to keep from you, save perhaps the ones that are not entirely mine to share." And so began, that evening, a series of long conversations that stretched late into the night over the weeks that followed. Conversations that peeled back layer after layer of the careful, guarded distance both of them had maintained since childhood, revealing two people who had each learned, through very different circumstances, what it meant to feel unwanted, and who were only now beginning to understand what it might feel like to be genuinely, unconditionally valued instead. The letter from Margaret arrived on a crisp morning in early autumn, carried by a rider who had traveled through the night to deliver it, a detail that immediately told Alara the contents held some urgency. She was seated in the garden, a shawl draped over her shoulders against the cooling air, when Lucy brought the sealed envelope to her, along with a second, smaller note addressed specifically to Alaric. "His Grace has been called to the north unexpectedly," Lucy explained, her expression carefully composed, though Alara could sense the young woman's concern beneath it. "Lady Margaret's husband has taken ill, and she has asked for her brother's presence while matters are settled." Alara felt a flicker of worry, both for Margaret's sake and for the sudden shift in the household's quiet rhythm. When Alaric found her moments later, his expression grave but controlled, she reached for his hand before he could speak. "Go to her," Alara said firmly. "She needs you, and I will manage well enough here in your absence." "I do not like leaving you so soon after our marriage," Alaric admitted, his fingers tightening briefly around hers. "It feels wrong, somehow, to depart when we have only just begun building this life together." "Your sister endured years of hardship you have told me about," Alara said gently. "She deserves your presence now, just as she would want you to trust that I am capable of managing in your absence. I am not so fragile as to fall apart the moment you leave the estate for a fortnight." Alaric studied her for a long moment, something like quiet pride settling into his expression. "No," he agreed softly, "I do not believe you are fragile at all." He departed within the hour, promising to write as soon as he had news, and Alara found herself, for the first time since her arrival, genuinely alone within the walls of Ashcombe, without his steady presence to lean upon should uncertainty arise. She expected, in some quiet corner of her mind, that the old anxieties might return in his absence, the familiar sense of being a burden left behind, forgotten and unimportant. Instead, she found something unexpected, a growing sense of her own capability, awakened by the responsibilities that now settled naturally upon her shoulders. Gareth approached her the following morning with a stack of estate ledgers, explaining that His Grace had left instructions that any decisions requiring immediate attention should be brought to her rather than delayed until his return. Alara stared at the ledgers with initial hesitation, uncertain whether she possessed the knowledge necessary to manage such matters. But Gareth's patient explanations soon revealed that the underlying principles were not so different from the household management she had quietly observed and absorbed during her weeks at Ashcombe. "His Grace trusts your judgment," Gareth said simply, when Alara voiced her uncertainty aloud. "He mentioned, before departing, that you possess a sharper mind for these matters than you have yet had opportunity to demonstrate." Over the following days, Alara threw herself into the work with an energy that surprised even herself. She reviewed tenant agreements with careful attention, noticing details that seemed to have been overlooked in previous seasons, small inefficiencies that, once corrected, promised meaningful savings without burdening the tenant farmers who depended on fair treatment for their livelihoods. She corresponded with local merchants regarding upcoming harvest sales, negotiating terms with a confidence she had not known she possessed until circumstances demanded it of her. She also began, during this period of quiet independence, to notice things about the estate that she believed could be improved further for those in circumstances similar to her own. She drafted a proposal, carefully written and thoroughly considered, suggesting that a portion of the estate's charitable funds be directed toward assisting tenant families whose members suffered from conditions that limited their mobility, providing practical resources such as wheeled chairs, modified tools, and adjusted housing arrangements that would allow them to contribute meaningfully to their households rather than being sidelined as burdens, as she herself had once been. When Alaric returned 2 weeks later, his sister's husband recovering steadily under careful treatment, he found Alara not diminished by his absence but seemingly strengthened by it. Her proposal document spread across the study desk, alongside neatly organized ledgers that Gareth confirmed had been managed with impressive care throughout the entire period. "You have been busy," Alaric observed, genuine admiration coloring his tone as he reviewed the proposal she handed him. "I found myself with time and purpose," Alara said, watching his expression carefully as he read through her carefully argued document. "I hope you do not think me presumptuous for taking such initiative in your absence." "Presumptuous," Alaric repeated, looking up from the pages with an expression that held nothing but genuine warmth. "Alara, this is exactly the kind of thinking I hoped this marriage might bring into our household. You have identified a need that I, despite years of managing this estate, never fully recognized, precisely because I never lived the experience you carry every single day. This is not presumption. This is exactly the contribution I hoped you might offer." Encouraged by his response, Alara continued developing her ideas over the following months, working alongside Gareth and occasionally consulting with local physicians regarding practical designs for mobility aids that could be produced affordably for tenant families in need. Word of these efforts spread slowly through the surrounding villages, and Alara found herself, for the first time in her life, recognized not for her limitations, but for the genuine good her efforts produced in the lives of others who had once felt as invisible as she herself had once felt. One afternoon, a tenant farmer named Nathaniel Hargrove arrived at the estate requesting to speak with Alara directly, his weathered face marked by an expression of cautious hope. His young daughter, he explained, had suffered a similar affliction to Alara's own following a difficult illness the previous winter, and he had heard whispers throughout the village of the Duchess's efforts to assist families in similar circumstances. Alara met with the man personally, listening carefully as he described his daughter's situation, and within the week, a properly fitted wheeled chair had been constructed and delivered to the Hargrove household, along with practical suggestions for adjusting their modest home to accommodate the girl's needs more comfortably. When Alara later visited the family herself, she found the young girl, no older than 9, sitting proudly in her new chair near the cottage's front window, her face bright with an expression Alara recognized intimately. The quiet relief of feeling, for the first time in far too long, genuinely considered rather than merely tolerated. "Thank you," the girl's mother said, her voice thick with emotion as she gripped Alara's hand tightly. "You do not know what this means to us. We had begun to fear our Sophie would never again feel like more than a burden upon this family." "I understand more than you might realize," Alara said softly, glancing toward young Sophie, whose bright eyes watched her with open curiosity rather than the wary hesitation Alara had grown accustomed to seeing in strangers' expressions. "I once feared the very same thing myself, and I promise you, your daughter's worth has never been measured by what her legs can or cannot do." That evening, recounting the visit to Alaric over dinner, Alara found herself moved nearly to tears by the memory of young Sophie's bright expression, and Alaric reached across the table to take her hand gently in his own. "You are doing remarkable work," he said quietly. "Work that reaches far beyond the walls of this estate, touching lives in ways I never managed to achieve despite years of trying my best to be a fair and generous landlord." "I could not have done any of this without your trust," Alara replied honestly. "You gave me the space and confidence to discover what I was truly capable of, rather than simply accepting the limitations others had always placed upon me." "I only opened a door," Alaric said. "You are the one who chose to walk through it, metaphorically speaking, with far more courage than I believe you yet give yourself credit for." As the months passed, Alara's initiatives expanded steadily, earning quiet recognition not only among the tenant families of Ashcombe, but eventually among neighboring estates as well, whose owners began writing to inquire about her methods for supporting workers with similar limitations. What had begun as a single proposal drafted during a fortnight of quiet independence had grown, gradually and organically, into something Alara had never imagined herself capable of building. A genuine legacy of practical compassion, born from years of personal hardship, transformed, through patience and purpose, into meaningful change for others who had once felt as forgotten as she herself once had. Winter settled over Ashcombe with a hush that softened the grounds beneath a fine layer of snow, and within the estate's walls, a different kind of warmth had taken root, one that Alara had never expected to find within a marriage that had begun as nothing more than a transaction between two families. She and Alaric had fallen into an easy companionship that neither of them seemed inclined to question too closely, content instead to let it grow at its own unhurried pace. Their evenings had become a quiet ritual, Alaric reading aloud from whatever book currently held his attention, while Alara worked on correspondence related to her growing charitable efforts, occasionally interrupting him with questions or observations that sparked conversations stretching long into the night. She had learned the particular cadence of his laughter, quiet and genuine, so different from the polite, performative chuckles she had grown accustomed to hearing at social gatherings throughout her life. She had learned, too, the small furrow that appeared between his brows when something troubled him deeply enough that he had not yet found words to express it. It was during one such evening, snow falling steadily outside the library windows, that Alara finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her mind since their very first conversation months earlier. "You once told me there was a longer story behind your reasons for choosing this marriage," she said, setting aside the letter she had been drafting. "Beyond your sister's illness, I mean. You said you would share it when it felt right. I wonder if perhaps that time has come." Alaric closed his book slowly, setting it aside with deliberate care, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, staring instead into the fire crackling gently in the hearth nearby. "There was a woman," he said finally, his voice quieter than Alara had ever heard it, "before you. Her name was Charlotte, and I loved her, or believed I did, with the particular intensity that comes with youth and inexperience. She suffered an illness during our courtship that left her similarly unable to walk, much as Margaret once experienced, though Charlotte's condition, unlike my sister's, never improved." Alara remained silent, sensing that whatever came next required patience rather than interruption. "I did not abandon her," Alaric continued, his jaw tight. "Not directly, but I confess to my great shame that I began to withdraw from her slowly, uncertain how to navigate a life so different from what I had once imagined for us. I told myself I needed time to adjust, that my hesitation was reasonable given the unexpected circumstances. Charlotte, I believe, sensed my withdrawal long before I was willing to admit it to myself, and she ended our engagement before I could summon the courage to do what I now recognize would have been an act of profound cowardice. What happened to her? Ilara asked softly. She married another man eventually, a kind physician who never once hesitated in his devotion to her, regardless of her condition, Alaric said. I attended their wedding, out of obligation and lingering guilt, and watched him lift her gently at the ceremony's conclusion, carrying her from the chapel with such natural ease and evident love that I understood, in that single moment, exactly how thoroughly I had failed her through my own fear and hesitation. Ilara felt her chest tighten with a complicated mixture of sympathy and understanding. And so when my father's letter arrived, she said slowly, piecing together the full picture, requesting this arrangement, I saw an opportunity to prove to myself that I had learned from my own failures, Alaric admitted. I will not pretend my initial motivations were entirely selfless, Ilara. Part of me sought this marriage as a chance for redemption, a way to demonstrate, if only to myself, that I was capable of the devotion I had once so thoroughly failed to provide when it mattered most. And now, Ilara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, is that still your only reason for the care you show me? Alaric rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her wheeled chair as he had done that first day beside the pond, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. No, he said firmly. What began as an attempt at redemption has become something far deeper than I ever anticipated. I did not expect to fall in love with you, Ilara. I expected perhaps to build a respectful partnership, a marriage founded on mutual consideration rather than romantic affection. Instead, I find myself utterly captivated by your sharp mind, your quiet resilience, the compassion you extend so freely to others despite everything life has taken from you. I do not care for you out of guilt over Charlotte any longer. I care for you because you are Ilara, entirely your own person, deserving of love not as compensation for past failures, but simply because you are remarkable, exactly as you are. Tears gathered in Ilara's eyes, and this time she did not blink them away. I did not expect to fall in love with you either, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I arrived here prepared for tolerance at best, and instead found genuine partnership, and now, apparently, genuine love as well. I do not quite know what to do with such unexpected fortune, after so many years of believing myself unworthy of it. You need not do anything with it, except accept that you deserve it fully, Alaric said gently, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek. You have spent far too long believing your worth depended on your ability to walk, Ilara. I love you not despite your circumstances, but simply because of who you have become through navigating them with such quiet courage. They remained there for a long while, the fire crackling softly beside them, snow continuing to fall silently beyond the windows, and Ilara felt, for the first time in her entire life, completely and unconditionally seen, not as a burden to be managed or a debt to be settled, but as a woman genuinely, deeply loved. Their newfound openness with one another deepened over the following weeks, and Ilara found herself sharing memories she had long kept locked away, memories of childhood before her accident, of the brief, joyful years when she had run freely through her father's gardens without a single thought toward the fragility of her own body. She spoke of her mother, who had died when Ilara was young, and whose gentle memory had faded slowly beneath years of her father's cold indifference. Alaric listened to each memory with careful attention, never once flinching or growing uncomfortable, simply absorbing each piece of her history with the same patient devotion he had shown from their very first meeting. In turn, Alaric shared more of his own past, the pressure of inheriting his title at a young age following his father's sudden death, the loneliness of managing a vast estate without the guidance he had once expected to receive over many more years, the quiet guilt that had lingered regarding Charlotte long after their engagement's end. Each shared confession seemed to dissolve another layer of careful distance between them, until Ilara felt she understood Alaric not merely as her husband, but as a genuine partner whose vulnerabilities matched her own in ways she had never anticipated finding in another person. One particularly cold evening in late winter, as they sat together near the fire, Alaric turned to her with an expression she had not seen before, somewhere between nervousness and quiet determination. "I have been considering something," he said, "and I wish to discuss it with you before proceeding any further." "You sound uncharacteristically hesitant," Elara observed, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I have been in correspondence with several physicians regarding new treatments developed on the continent," Alaric said carefully. "Treatments specifically designed to address spinal injuries similar to your own. I did not wish to raise the matter without your knowledge, nor did I wish to suggest that your worth in any way depends upon regaining the use of your legs. But I thought perhaps you might wish to know the option exists, should you choose to pursue it." Elara sat with this information for a long moment, considering the complicated tangle of emotions it stirred within her. Part of her, the part that still remembered the freedom of running through gardens as a child, felt a flicker of cautious hope. But another part of her, hardened by years of failed treatments and dashed expectations during her childhood, felt wary of investing hope in yet another possibility that might ultimately disappoint. "I appreciate you telling me," she said finally, "and I confess I do not yet know how I feel about pursuing such treatment. I have built a life I am genuinely proud of, exactly as I am now. I would not want to feel as though my worth or your love for me depended in any way upon the outcome of such an attempt." "It does not," Alaric said immediately, firmly. "Nothing about my love for you depends on whether you walk or remain in your chair for the rest of your days. I raised the matter only because I believe you deserve to know your options, and to choose freely whether to pursue them, without any pressure from me either way." "Then perhaps," Elara said slowly, "I would like to learn more cautiously without expectation, if only to understand what possibilities genuinely exist, rather than continuing to wonder." Alaric nodded, relief and respect mingling in his expression. "Whatever you decide and whatever the outcome, I will remain exactly as devoted as I am today," he said. "That much I promise you without hesitation." As winter began slowly to loosen its grip upon Ashcombe's frozen gardens, Elara found herself approaching the future with a cautious optimism she had never before allowed herself to feel, buoyed not by false hope, but by the genuine, steady partnership she had built with a man who loved her fully, exactly as she was, while still supporting whatever path she chose to walk, quite literally, toward her own future. Spring arrived early that year, coaxing the first green shoots from Ashcombe's gardens well before the calendar suggested it should, and with the changing season came an unwelcome visitor, whose arrival Elara had quietly dreaded since the day she left her father's home. Baron Edmund Whitmore's carriage rolled through the estate's gates on a gray morning, unannounced and uninvited, carrying with it the same cold calculation Elara remembered from every interaction throughout her childhood. She was in the garden when Gareth informed her of the Baron's arrival, tending carefully to a bed of early flowers with the assistance of tools specifically designed to allow her to reach the soil comfortably from her chair. Her hand stilled immediately upon hearing the news, old anxieties rising sharp and immediate despite the months of healing she had experienced within Ashcombe's walls. "Does His Grace know?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "He has been informed and is currently receiving the Baron in the main study," Gareth confirmed. "He asked that I find you and inquire whether you wish to join them, or whether you would prefer to remain elsewhere until the visit concludes." Elara considered the offer for a long moment. Months ago, she might have chosen to remain distant, avoiding a confrontation that promised only old wounds and familiar cruelty. But something within her had shifted since her arrival at Ashcombe, strengthened by months of genuine respect and the quiet confidence she had built through her charitable work and her deepening partnership with Alaric. "I will join them," she said finally, straightening in her chair with new resolve. "I have hidden from my father's judgment for long enough." When she arrived at the study, wheeled by Lucy, who offered a small, encouraging smile before stepping back respectfully, she found her father seated across from Alaric, his posture rigid with the particular stiffness he adopted whenever he believed himself entitled to something he had not yet secured. "Elara," her father said, rising briefly as she entered, though his tone carried none of the warmth the gesture might have suggested to an unfamiliar observer. "You look well. Married life clearly agrees with you." "Father," Alara replied evenly, refusing to let old habits soften her voice into the deference he had always expected. "I confess I am surprised by your visit. You did not send word ahead." "I had business to discuss with your husband," the Baron said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Alaric before returning to Alara. "Matters of family, which I believed might benefit from your presence as well, given the circumstances." Alaric's expression had grown noticeably cooler since Alara's arrival, and she recognized in his careful, measured posture the same protective quality he had shown that very first day, lifting her from the carriage despite the watching eyes of servants uncertain how to proceed. "Your father has come requesting additional funds," Alaric said plainly, cutting through whatever careful framing the Baron had likely intended to employ. "He claims further debts have accumulated since our previous arrangement, debts he suggests I am obligated to settle given our new family connection." Alara felt something cold settle in her stomach, an old, familiar dread mixed now with a fresh anger she had not previously allowed herself to fully feel toward her father's manipulations. "Obligated," she repeated slowly. "You traded me away to settle one set of debts, and now you return expecting further payment simply because the arrangement proved successful the first time." "Do not speak to me in that tone," her father said sharply, old authority creeping into his voice, the same tone that had once made Alara shrink smaller in her chair, uncertain of her own worth. "I am still your father, and family obligations run in both directions, regardless of the arrangements we have made." "Family obligations," Alara said, and to her own surprise, she found her voice growing stronger rather than smaller, steadied by months of genuine respect that had taught her exactly how differently a father might treat a daughter he actually valued. "You traded me away like a piece of furniture you no longer wish to store, father. You did not consider my feelings, my preferences, or my worth as anything beyond a convenient solution to your financial troubles. And now you return, expecting further generosity, as though our relationship carries any weight beyond the transaction you yourself reduced it to." The Baron's face reddened, though whether from anger or the discomfort of confronting an inconvenient truth, Alara could not be certain. "I gave you a home when your mother died," he said stiffly. "I provided for your care after your accident, regardless of the expense it placed upon this family." "You provided the bare minimum required to avoid public scandal," Alara countered, her hands steady in her lap despite the emotion coursing through her. "And you never once let me forget what a burden that minimal care represented to you. I have spent 6 years believing myself worthless, because of how thoroughly you communicated that belief through every dismissive glance and every impatient sigh." Alaric remained quiet throughout this exchange, allowing Alara the space to speak for herself, though his posture radiated a protective readiness that Alara found deeply reassuring even as she found her own strength to confront her father directly. "I did not come here to be lectured by my own daughter," the Baron said finally, turning his attention back toward Alaric. "I came to discuss a reasonable request between family members. Surely you understand the importance of maintaining favorable relations with your wife's remaining family, Your Grace, particularly given how thoroughly this arrangement has benefited your own household." "I understand a great deal, Baron Whitmore," Alaric said, his voice cold and precise in a way Alara had never heard him use before. "I understand that you traded your own daughter's welfare for financial convenience without a single thought toward her feelings or her future happiness. I understand that you have spent 6 years treating a woman of remarkable intelligence and compassion as though she were nothing more than a burden to be managed and eventually discarded. And I understand, quite clearly, that you have returned today believing that the arrangement you engineered entitles you to endless further generosity, simply because you succeeded once in extracting what you wanted from a stranger's sense of obligation." "That is not," the Baron began, but Alaric continued without pause, his tone leaving no room for interruption. "I will not provide further funds," Alaric said firmly. Not because I lack the resources to do so, but because I refuse to reward the manner in which you have treated your daughter throughout her life. Alara's worth was never dependent on the debts you owed, nor is my devotion to her contingent upon maintaining favorable relations with a man who saw fit to trade her away like unwanted property. You are welcome to correspond with her directly, should she wish to maintain any relationship with you at all. But I will not serve as an endless source of funds for a man who has demonstrated, repeatedly, that he views his own daughter as nothing more than a financial instrument. The Baron's face had gone pale, clearly unaccustomed to such direct refusal from someone he had expected to remain compliant given the earlier success of his manipulations. He turned toward Alara, his expression shifting toward something that might have been an attempt at wounded appeal. "Alara, surely you can speak to your husband on my behalf. I am still your father, whatever mistakes I may have made." Alara studied him for a long moment, searching for some flicker of genuine remorse beneath his words, some sign that his appeal came from actual regret rather than mere frustration at having his manipulation exposed and refused. She found none. "I will not ask my husband to provide you with anything further," she said quietly, but with unmistakable finality. "You made your choice 6 years ago, father, and you confirmed that choice again just now, coming here not out of genuine concern for my well-being, but seeking further advantage from an arrangement you engineered without any consideration for my feelings. I hope, someday, you might genuinely reflect upon how you treated me throughout my life. But I will no longer allow that reflection, however unlikely it may be to occur, to determine my own sense of worth or happiness." The Baron remained silent for a long moment, clearly recognizing that further argument would yield nothing, before rising stiffly from his chair. "I see this visit has been a waste of my time," he said coldly, some of his earlier composure cracking to reveal the bitter frustration beneath. "I had hoped my daughter might retain some measure of family loyalty, whatever her circumstances." "Loyalty is earned through care, father," Alara said softly, "not demanded through obligation. You never once earned mine, and I no longer intend to pretend otherwise simply to maintain appearances." The Baron departed shortly afterward, his carriage rolling away from Ashcombe's gates with none of the confident authority it had arrived with hours earlier. Alara remained in the study long after his departure, staring at the empty chair where he had sat, processing the strange mixture of grief and relief that accompanied finally confronting a truth she had known, somewhere deep within herself, for the entirety of her life. "Are you well?" Alaric asked gently, kneeling beside her chair as had become his habit whenever difficult conversations arose between them. "I believe I am actually," Alara said, surprising herself with the genuine steadiness of her own voice. "I have spent years fearing this exact confrontation, imagining it would break something within me that I had only just begun to heal. Instead, I find myself feeling lighter, as though I have finally set down a weight I did not fully realize I was still carrying." "You were remarkable," Alaric said, admiration clear in his voice. "I do not believe I have ever witnessed anyone confront their own father with such clarity and dignity, particularly given everything he put you through." "I could not have found that clarity 6 months ago," Alara admitted. "This household and your steady presence within it gave me the space and confidence to discover strength I did not know I possessed. Thank you for defending me so firmly, even before I found my own words to speak." "You needed no defending," Alaric said, taking her hand gently in his own. "You handled him entirely on your own terms. I simply refused to let him believe, even for a moment, that his manipulation would succeed a second time." That evening, as they sat together in the library, the fire crackling softly beside them, Alara felt a profound sense of closure settle over her, the last remaining thread connecting her to her father's cold indifference finally, deliberately, cut. Whatever relationship remained between them now, if any remained at all, would exist entirely on her terms, shaped by her own sense of worth rather than his careless dismissal of it. And for the first time since her accident so many years ago, Alara felt truly, completely free of the belief that her value depended on anyone's approval but her own. By early summer, Word of the Duchess of Ashcombe's charitable work had traveled well beyond the boundaries of the estate's own tenant lands, reaching the ears of nobility who had once whispered cruelly about the broken bride the Duke had taken as his wife. Alara received an invitation, addressed personally to her rather than simply extended as an afterthought to Alaric's own invitation, requesting her presence at a gathering hosted by Lady Pembroke, a woman known throughout the county for her genuine interest in charitable causes rather than mere social climbing. "You do not have to attend if you would rather not," Alaric said, watching her study the invitation with an unreadable expression. "I know such gatherings have not always treated you kindly." "I know," Alara said slowly, setting the invitation down with careful deliberation. "But I believe I would like to attend this time. I am tired of avoiding rooms simply because I once feared what waited within them. Perhaps it is time to test whether those old fears still hold the same power they once did." The evening of the gathering arrived with a nervous energy that reminded Alara uncomfortably of countless social events throughout her childhood. Evenings spent watching from the edges of rooms while relatives whispered about her condition just beyond her hearing, or so they believed. But as her carriage arrived at Lady Pembroke's estate, and Alaric once again lifted her personally rather than summoning servants to manage the task, Alara felt something different settle over her, a quiet confidence that had not existed within her 6 months earlier. Lady Pembroke greeted them personally at the entrance, her expression warm and genuine as she took Alara's hand. "Duchess Ashcombe," she said warmly, "I have heard remarkable things about your charitable initiatives. My own cousin's daughter benefited greatly from the mobility aids your program provided last winter. I confess I invited you tonight hoping you might share more about your methods with some of the other ladies present, several of whom have expressed genuine interest in supporting similar efforts within their own communities." Alara felt a flush of surprised pleasure at this greeting, so different from the cold curiosity she had braced herself to encounter. Throughout the evening, she found herself engaged in genuine conversation with women who asked thoughtful questions about her work, rather than the awkward, pitying inquiries she had grown accustomed to enduring at similar gatherings throughout her childhood. Several ladies expressed genuine interest in establishing similar programs within their own estates, and by evening's end, Alara had secured commitments from 3 separate households eager to replicate the mobility aid initiative she had developed at Ashcombe. "You have transformed an entire evening I once would have dreaded into something genuinely productive," Alara remarked to Alaric as their carriage carried them home beneath a sky scattered with stars. "I did nothing tonight beyond simply standing beside you," Alaric replied. "You transformed that room entirely on your own merit, Alara. I suspect those women recognized something in you that had nothing to do with your legs, and everything to do with your evident intelligence and genuine compassion." In the weeks that followed, Alara's charitable network expanded rapidly, drawing support from households across the county and eventually from neighboring counties as well. As word spread of the practical, meaningful difference her programs made in the lives of families who had once felt as forgotten and unwanted as she herself had once felt. She corresponded regularly with physicians developing new mobility aids, coordinated fundraising efforts among sympathetic noble families, and personally visited dozens of households to ensure the resources provided genuinely met each family's specific needs, rather than offering a generic solution that failed to account for individual circumstances. Throughout this period, Alara had continued corresponding cautiously with the physicians Alaric had first mentioned regarding potential treatment for her own condition, gathering information without committing to any particular course of action. She eventually agreed to a preliminary examination from a specialist who had traveled from the continent specifically to consult with several patients whose injuries resembled her own, and though the physician offered no guarantees, he suggested that a series of careful treatments, combined with gradual physical therapy, might offer some meaningful improvement, though full recovery remained unlikely given the years that had passed since her original injury. "I do not know if I wish to pursue this," Alara admitted to Alaric one evening after the physician's departure, her expression troubled as she considered the possibility that had once seemed entirely closed to her. I have built an identity, a purpose, an entire sense of self around navigating this world exactly as I am now. I fear that pursuing treatment might suggest, even to myself, that this identity was somehow insufficient, that I have been waiting all along for some external fix rather than genuinely accepting who I already am. There is no correct answer here, Alara, Alaric said gently, taking her hands in his own. Choosing to pursue treatment does not diminish everything you have built, nor does choosing not to pursue it represent some failure of ambition. Whatever you decide, your worth remains exactly as it is today, remarkable, complete, and entirely independent of whether your legs eventually regain some measure of function. After several more weeks of careful consideration, Alara made her decision. I will pursue the treatment, she told Alaric finally, her voice steady with genuine conviction rather than desperate hope. Not because I believe myself incomplete without it, but because I am curious, and because I believe pursuing this possibility, whatever its outcome, represents another form of the same courage that has carried me through everything else I have faced since arriving at Ashcombe. Then I will support you fully through every step of that process, Alaric promised, exactly as I have supported every other decision you have made since the day I lifted you from that carriage. The treatment began that autumn, a careful and often uncomfortable process that required patience. Alara drew upon the same reserves that had sustained her through years of childhood hardship and months of building her charitable work from nothing. Alaric remained by her side throughout each difficult session, offering steady encouragement without ever pressuring her to continue beyond what she felt capable of enduring. Progress, when it came, arrived slowly and inconsistently, small victories mixed with occasional setbacks that tested her resolve in ways she had not fully anticipated. Throughout this challenging period, her charitable work continued to flourish, providing a sense of purpose and accomplishment that balanced the uncertain, often frustrating journey of her medical treatment. She began receiving letters from families across the country whose lives had been touched by resources her initiatives had provided. Each letter a reminder that her worth had never depended on the outcome of any single medical procedure, however much hope she allowed herself to feel regarding its eventual results. By winter's arrival, nearly a year after her initial arrival at Ashcombe as a frightened, uncertain bride traded away by an indifferent father, Alara Whitmore, now Alara Ashcombe, had transformed not only her own circumstances, but the lives of countless others who had once felt as invisible and unwanted as she herself had once believed herself to be. And regardless of whatever progress her ongoing treatment might eventually yield, she understood, with a certainty that had taken years of hardship and months of genuine love to build, that her worth had never depended on her legs at all, but on the strength, compassion, and quiet courage she carried within herself, qualities that no accident, no cruel father, and no uncertain medical outcome could ever diminish or take away. A full year after Alara's arrival at Ashcombe, on the anniversary of the day Alaric had first lifted her from that carriage beneath a gray and uncertain sky, the estate prepared for a celebration unlike any Alara had experienced before. Alaric had requested, quietly and with evident nervousness that seemed unusual for a man normally so composed, that she join him in the garden near the pond where they had shared their first truly honest conversation so many months earlier. Alara arrived at the appointed spot to find the garden transformed. Soft lanterns hung among the trees despite the fading light of early evening, casting warm golden glows across paths now familiar beneath her wheels. Alaric waited near the water's edge, dressed simply rather than in the formal attire she might have expected for whatever occasion he had planned, and his expression, as she approached, held a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. "You once asked me why I agreed to this marriage," Alaric said, kneeling beside her chair as had become their familiar habit whenever conversation turned toward matters of genuine importance. "I gave you an honest answer that day, though an incomplete one, focused mostly on guilt and a desire for redemption regarding past failures. Tonight, I wanted to give you a fuller answer, one built not on old guilt, but on everything I have learned about you since that very first day." He reached into his coat and produced a small box, and Alara felt her heart quicken despite already wearing the ring that had marked their marriage for a full year now. "This is not a proposal in the traditional sense," Alaric said, opening the box to reveal a second ring, simpler than her wedding band but no less meaningful for its restraint. "We are already married, and I do not intend to suggest otherwise. But I wanted to mark this day, the anniversary of when I first met the woman who would come to mean everything to me, with a promise made freely, entirely of my own choosing, rather than one arranged through contracts and debts settled between families who never once considered your own feelings in the matter." Tears gathered in Alara's eyes as she watched him continue, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath his careful words. "Alara, a year ago, I lifted a frightened stranger from a carriage, uncertain what kind of woman I would find beneath the fear I could see clearly on her face. I did not know then that I would find someone whose strength would eventually humble my own, whose compassion would extend so freely to strangers despite everything life had once taken from her, whose sharp mind and quiet courage would transform not only my own life, but the lives of countless families across this county who had once felt as forgotten as you yourself once believed you were. I love you not as some act of redemption for past failures, and not out of pity for circumstances beyond your control, but because you are remarkable, entirely and completely, exactly as you are. I promise you, freely and without any contract or obligation binding me to these words beyond my own genuine devotion, that I will spend every remaining year of my life ensuring you never again doubt your own worth." Alara took the ring with trembling hands, unable to speak for a long moment as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. "I arrived here a year ago believing myself a debt paid, a burden finally settled," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I never imagined I would leave that carriage and find, instead, a genuine partnership built on respect, understanding, and love so complete that I sometimes still struggle to believe I deserve it. Thank you, Alaric, not simply for lifting me from that carriage, but for lifting me, in every sense, from the belief that my worth depended on anything beyond my own character and the strength I carry within myself." They remained beside the pond long into the evening, the lantern's warm glow reflecting softly across the water's still surface, and Alara felt, more completely than ever before, the profound truth of everything the past year had taught her. That love, genuine and unconditional, had nothing whatsoever to do with the strength of one's legs, and everything to do with the strength of one's heart. In the months that followed, Alara's medical treatment yielded modest but meaningful progress, allowing her, with considerable effort and the support of carefully designed braces, to stand unassisted for short periods, though her wheeled chair remained an essential and unashamed part of her daily life. She never viewed this progress as validation of some deficiency in who she had been before, but simply as one additional tool available to her, no more significant to her sense of self-worth than any other resource she might choose to use. Her charitable initiatives continued expanding across the region, eventually earning recognition from figures well beyond the county's borders, who sought her guidance in establishing similar programs within their own communities. She and Alaric welcomed their first child 2 years after their wedding, a daughter they named Charlotte, in quiet, deliberate honor of the woman whose story had first taught Alaric the profound cost of hesitation and fear in matters of genuine love. Baron Whitmore never returned to Ashcombe, nor did Alara ever seek to repair the relationship he had so thoroughly damaged through years of cold indifference and calculated cruelty. She occasionally received letters from him, requesting funds or expressing vague, unconvincing regret, and she responded to each with the same steady, dignified boundaries she had established during his final visit, neither cruel nor accommodating, simply firm in the knowledge that her worth no longer depended on his approval or his presence in her life. Years later, when young Charlotte, herself a curious and spirited child, asked her mother about the wheeled chair that remained a constant companion throughout Alara's days, Alara would smile and tell her daughter the story of a frightened young woman traded away by an uncaring father, and a duke who had lifted her from a carriage not out of obligation, but out of genuine, immediate respect for her inherent worth as a person. She would tell her daughter that legs, however useful, had never determined anyone's true value, and that the greatest strength a person could possess lived not in their limbs, but in their heart, their mind, and their unwavering commitment to treating others with the dignity every single person deserved, regardless of circumstances entirely beyond their control. And every year, on the anniversary of that first meeting, Alaric would find Alara near the garden pond as evening settled softly over Ashcombe's grounds, and he would kneel beside her, exactly as he had that very first day, reaffirming through simple, quiet presence the promise he had made so many years earlier, that he would spend every remaining year of his life ensuring she never again doubted the profound, unconditional worth she carried within herself, a worth that had never once depended on whether she could walk, but had always, from the very beginning, depended entirely on the remarkable character of the woman she had always been. 3 years into their marriage, a new challenge arrived at Ashcombe, one that tested the strength of their partnership in ways neither Alara nor Alaric had anticipated. A distant cousin of Alaric's, a man named Edwin Castlemaine who stood several places behind Alaric in the line of inheritance, had grown increasingly resentful as word spread of young Charlotte's birth, understanding clearly that any further children born to the couple would push his own family's claim to the Ashcombe title even further from reach. Edwin arrived at the estate one afternoon under the pretense of a friendly visit, all warm smiles and polished manners, but Alara sensed something unsettling beneath his practiced charm from the very first moment he stepped through the entrance hall. She said nothing of her unease to Alaric that first evening, uncertain whether her instincts reflected genuine danger or simply lingering wariness born from years of learning to distrust smooth-talking relatives. Her instincts proved correct within days. Gareth discovered, quite by accident, that several estate documents had been quietly disturbed during Edwin's visit, papers relating to the succession and management of Ashcombe's holdings that no guest should have had any reason to examine. When confronted carefully, a young footman admitted with evident fear that Edwin had offered him a substantial sum to copy certain documents and to report on the household's daily movements, particularly regarding young Charlotte's routines. "He means to challenge the succession somehow," Alaric said grimly, pacing the length of his study while Alara reviewed the recovered documents with a sharp, analytical eye that had only grown keener through her years managing the estate's charitable ledgers. "Or worse, he means some harm toward Charlotte herself, believing that removing her from the succession entirely would strengthen his own family's claim." "We must act carefully," Alara said, her voice steady despite the fear tightening in her chest at the thought of any danger reaching her young daughter. "If we confront him directly without proof, he will simply retreat and wait for a subtler opportunity. We need evidence enough to expose him thoroughly, publicly, so that no doubt remains regarding his intentions." Together, they devised a careful plan. Alara, drawing on the network of trust she had built through years of charitable work across the county, quietly enlisted the help of several tenant families whose loyalty to the Ashcombe household ran deep, asking them to watch discreetly for any unusual activity near the estate's borders. Gareth, meanwhile, arranged for the footman who had confessed his involvement to continue reporting false information to Edwin, feeding him carefully constructed details that would draw him into revealing his full intentions. The plan reached its climax on a stormy evening nearly 2 weeks later, when word reached the estate that Edwin had arranged for a carriage to intercept young Charlotte's nurse during a planned outing to the village, intending to take the child under some false pretense before her absence could be discovered. Alara, refusing to remain safely behind while her daughter faced danger, insisted on accompanying Alaric and several trusted estate guards as they intercepted the planned route well before Edwin's men could act. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded swiftly along the muddy road leading toward the village, rain lashing down around them as Alaric's guards surrounded Edwin's carriage before his men could complete their scheme. Alara, seated in her chair positioned safely within their own carriage, but with a clear view of the unfolding confrontation, watched as Alaric confronted his cousin directly, presenting him with the very documents Edwin had believed safely hidden, along with sworn statements from the footmen detailing every element of the conspiracy. Edwin, cornered and unable to deny what stood plainly before him, attempted first bluster and then desperate pleading, but Alaric's expression remained coldly resolute. "You will leave this county tonight," Alaric said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of falling rain, "and you will never again attempt to threaten my family. I have already sent word to the appropriate authorities detailing your actions. Whether you face further consequences depends entirely on how quickly and completely you disappear from our lives." Edwin departed that very night, his schemes thoroughly exposed, and his reputation among the county's nobility permanently damaged by whispers that spread quickly once the full details of his conspiracy became known. Charlotte remained safely at Ashcombe throughout the entire ordeal, never once placed in the direct danger her parents had feared, thanks to the careful planning Alara herself had helped orchestrate. "You did not need to come tonight," Alaric said later, once they had returned safely to Ashcombe's warm halls, Charlotte sleeping peacefully in her nursery under the watchful care of trusted staff. "I would have understood if you preferred to remain safely behind." "I could not have remained behind," Alara said firmly, "not while our daughter's safety hung in the balance. I have spent years proving to myself, and to everyone who once doubted me, that my worth and my capability do not depend on my legs. I was not about to abandon that truth on the one night it mattered most." Alaric studied her for a long moment, admiration and love mingling clearly in his expression. "I do not believe I will ever stop being amazed by you," he said quietly. "Every time I believe I have fully understood the depth of your strength, you reveal yet another layer I had not yet discovered." In the weeks that followed, life at Ashcombe gradually returned to its familiar, peaceful rhythm, though the incident with Edwin served as a quiet reminder to both Alara and Alaric of how precious and how fiercely worth protecting their family truly was. Alara's charitable network, upon learning of the danger that had briefly threatened the household they had all come to respect and admire, rallied around the family with genuine warmth and support, further strengthening the bonds of community that Alara had spent years carefully building throughout the region. Charlotte grew into a bright, curious child, entirely unaware of how close danger had once come to touching her young life, protected always by parents whose partnership had only grown stronger through every challenge they faced together. And Alara, watching her daughter play happily in the very gardens where she herself had once learned to trust again, after years of believing herself unwanted, understood with complete certainty that the life she had built at Ashcombe, born from what once seemed like nothing more than a cruel transaction between an indifferent father and a stranger, had become something far more profound than she ever could have imagined on that gray, frightening day when a duke first lifted her gently from a carriage and changed the entire course of her life forever.